talking about elevating out-of-town appeal, and I've got James Honeyman, who's a partner at Quadrant Estates with me. Hi, James.
Hi, Lisa.
And also Paul Davis, founder of Nimbus Maps. Thanks for joining us, Paul. Now let's go straight in. What can out-of-town destinations offer that city centres can't? James, you kick off on that one.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. I think there's been a lot in the press, obviously, about the divergence to people shopping out of town during COVID, and those trends we think are continuing at the moment. We all know that we probably use retail parks more during COVID, but from our perspective, that was a trend that was already in place pre-COVID, but was accentuated by the impact of lockdown. People found out-of-town retail very convenient. They found it a safe environment. They found it the environment where they could get all of their convenience needs. And we think those trends have continued. Unfortunately, a lot of the town centres show almost some of the opposite trends, where you have to pay for car parking, they're difficult to get in and out of. Obviously, during the COVID period in enclosed environments, they were more restricted. And we're all aware, particularly, say with the challenges with Wilco over the last couple of weeks, that the high street continues to be challenged. That being said, obviously the picture is different throughout the country. There's some very, very strong high streets, particularly market towns where people do use the high street quite a lot. But we feel the out-of-town picture has been almost indiscriminate, where throughout the UK, in locations where the high streets have suffered, the retail parks can still be doing really strongly, because those fundamentals are pinned into how people like to shop nowadays.
And Paul?
Yeah, I think what we're sort of seeing is obviously the obvious thing about out-of-town centres is they have much more space. Yeah. So the rise of the EV charging is kind of wild at the moment, and of course with that extra car park and with extra space, obviously you can now create an event out of charging the car ultimately, and that's kind of a lot of what the EV charging companies are kind of particularly bothered about. And one of the things I found very interesting recently was that one of the big retailers is now sort of saying, so as you go through COVID, there's sort of the whole movement to buying stuff online, and typically when you buy stuff online, you buy 3 of the same top, one in each of the 3 sizes. You're not quite sure whether it fits or not, and so you buy 3 and send 2 back and keep 1. And one of the big retailers recently is now saying, well, actually, if you're going to do that, that's fine. We're going to charge you to send it back. And so what I think is going to happen is, of course, that because the out-of-town retail is so easy to get to, that typically we're sort of being pushed back towards retail. So where online it was a case of, well, I buy 3 and I send 2 back and that's all fine. Because we're now going to get charged £2.50 to send the stuff back, well, actually, I may well go to the out-of-town retail place, go and choose the size that actually fits, and then buy that top there instead of doing what we did before. And so I think the kind of the picture of out-of-town now as a place to go and collect stuff and sort of click and collect is then becoming much more kind of relevant, especially now as this sort of move, because of the cost of sending this stuff back in these habits we've kind of generated through COVID. It's going to be a really interesting place to sit, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually, isn't it? Because why would you pay, say £5 to send 2 parcels back when you can just drive down to your local retail park and try it on, etc.?
Absolutely.
That could be a real boon for the retail park, actually, and the high street potentially.
This is what was coming sort of very clear in my head, is that sort of pendulum of the property market sort of swing back, and ultimately the cost to the retailer of sending this stuff back is so significant nowadays that actually I thought it was kind of really interesting sort of movement in the marketplace, really.
Now, out-of-town locations are attracting new types of tenants, for example, data centres and EV charging stations.
Yeah, sure.
What impact is this having? What impact is this likely to have on rents and on the environment of these out-of-town destinations?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Lisa. There are some new entrants into the market, and there's some established entrants that have adapted their format as well. So what we've tended to see over the last couple of years is a lot of discount food, single price stroke discount operators, but also new entrants coming to the market and finding that they can either take a store to supplement their town centre location, or they can actually start off acquiring out of town and bypass a city centre or a shopping centre altogether. I think in terms of what the impact that's going to have on rents, obviously that's yet to be seen. We are seeing pockets of rental growth in the market.
Whereabouts are you seeing this rental growth, James?
I think rather than it being sort of specific geographical locations, I mean, the easy answer is southeast. Everything seems to be southeast. But I think where we're seeing it are specific schemes that have potentially worked hard via their own asset management to create some evidence to prove rental growth within a town. So how we look at it is very much, it's not necessarily just southeast or south versus north. We look after at Quadrant a range of assets throughout the country, and some of the best assets that we look after are out a long way outside the southeast. And we've been able to work these assets. We know their locations, that we've got the mix right by listening to feedback, having a close occupier relationship, and then we've been able to generate some rental growth on the back of that.
That's great news. And Paul?
And I suppose the interesting thing as well, in case you missed it through COVID, is the change of the use class order. So obviously retail now forms part of Class E, as do offices and as do industrial buildings. So back in the day, in a place like completely retail, we're talking A1, A2 and kind of all the A classes. Whereas, of course, now it's just part of a big mix of commercial use. And so I think there's the impact of data centres like that on out-of-town space. But I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is that out-of-town retail unit is now the same use class as the warehouse that sits behind it. And actually, what that then creates is a different opportunity, I think, for the well-located shed to become retail, and actually the sort of the trade counter and this sort of stuff, and how that then sort of perhaps moves that marketplace and sort of opens it up a little bit. So I think a slightly odd answer to, out-of-town retail, we're thinking of a retail park, but of course that's now the same use as a well-located shed, that's now the same building ultimately. And so kind of how that sort of changes, I think there's a sort of a wider problem with that and a wider question around a retail unit now can be used as an office or can be used as a light industrial building where before it couldn't. And so I think that kind of then also adds another layer of dimension to kind of supply and demand and where the rents might go to as well. So I think that's kind of a sort of quite a deep question to answer, really.
You did it very well.
Thank you.
Can you share, Paul, any notable trends or emerging consumer behaviours that are impacting out-of-town retail development at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the obvious one is EV. So the obvious one is that kind of, I'm driving somewhere, I'm running out of electricity in my car. I think 1 in 5 cars now, new cars sold last month, whatever it was electric. And so this kind of rise of that, and of course, you look around completely retail and the place is full of EV charging companies looking for sites and this sort of stuff. And so I think that's an obvious trend that is really kind of hot. I mean, there's lots of very acquisitive companies in here looking, certainly food retail, drive-throughs, all that stuff is super hot. A lot of the, pardon the pun obviously, I think some of the coffee operators are now starting to think about that kind of out-of-town location. Things like, I saw on a requirement list recently that things like people like Cafe Nero are thinking about the drive-through operation, this sort of stuff.
Which it seems crazy, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
But they've not been on out-of-town retail parks before in terms of a drive-through location, and you think, hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Prior.
And the likes of Greg's doing the same sort of thing as well. So that's sort of almost what is traditionally it's an inline retailer ultimately. It's an inline shop with you go to the front and buy. Kind of the idea now of drive-throughs and this sort of stuff is becoming a very, very big trend, I think, really. So and there's quite a lot of other stuff that we've seen. Certainly from our point of view, we've seen a lot of very well-funded, VC-backed occupier firms, a lot of pet shops and this sort of stuff, where they're, again, well-funded, looking for space and this sort of stuff. So quite a few sort of local trends, I think, or quite a few trends for the right location, really.
Okay, James?
If I could just add to that, I agree with a lot of what Paul said there, and I'd also say that bigger and better stores, and there's a number of retailers, so M&S, Fraser's Great Sports Direct, retailers maybe having slightly fewer locations but having better quality locations, reinvesting into the stores, the environment, making that a lot more elevated, to use a word that we're basing this around, and actually really investing back into the physical environment. We touched on click and collect earlier and returning to store. I think there's been quite a lot of evidence for a few years now in the market that drives quite a lot of incremental sales. So if you take your parcel back, you typically then spend some more money when you're in store. You don't just return it and swap it for another size or get your money back. So I think a lot of that is all pointing towards the strength of the physical environment, and there's quite a lot of retailer anecdotes out there about how much the store environment has been valued post-COVID. what I think was a trend where people were expecting it maybe to go the other way, and online, to keep growing and growing. We know that online has sort of slipped back quarter on quarter, as a percentage of the market. And I think all this points towards a lot more strength in the physical environment, and that's also reflected by, as I say, retailer investment in stores.
Yeah, absolutely. We touched on it just a second ago about new entrants into out-of-town retail locations like Cafe Nero with drive-thrus, etc. Is there anyone else out there kind of circling, looking to get foothold in the out-of-town retail market that we haven't necessarily thought of before?
There's a lot of F&B entrants potentially, coming through. So we've obviously seen, as you touched on, Cafe Nero, Black Sheep Coffee have come into out-of-town market. Chaiwala. There's a lot of people looking to get good quality F&B space, and that's hard.
People like Popeyes,
yeah,
maybe?
Popeyes have obviously opened on the first store in Rotherham, but getting space for good quality drive-through sites is challenging, particularly on schemes. So that's a very competitive market. We've done a number of deals to people like Tim Hortons, obviously, Costa. We've talked to a lot of new entrants who have bid fairly strongly, and then as a landlord you have that consideration. Do I go with a sort of more household name, or do I try and keep it fresh? And the F&B market is something that always does reset and needs freshening up from time to time, so there's an interesting consideration there. Paul, I'll pass over.
And I guess from your point of view, it's quite challenging as well, because some of these businesses aren't as strong as the incumbents, and so you're sort of looking at your yields and thinking, well, is it a good thing to do it? How do I manage my centre going forward? I think it's a really difficult problem actually. It's like I want to bring people to the centre, make it trade well, but ultimately the rent I'm going to get may be similar, but my covenant's weaker, and is that the right thing for my estate? It's a really big challenge, I think, for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. James, I just wanted to ask you actually what strategies Quadrant are putting in place to provide an effective tenant mix in these out-of-town locations. What are you doing?
Sure. Not a simple question to answer that, but I'll try and give you a little bit of an insight maybe. We always start off by trying to really understand whatever asset we're working on. Yep. So although Quadrant is an experienced business with people that have got a lot of expertise in the out-of-town market, we always naturally take the time to understand exactly where that asset sits from a customer perspective, from a retailer perspective, hopefully understand where these stores sit in the portfolio, etc., and what we're missing. And I think the mix is interesting. You can have a scheme, as we have, with 7 or 8 different use types, and you can have a scheme with 3, and they can both function well. So it's all dependent on the catchment, what the catchment's after, what your competition is, and also then how well that store fits into the omni-channel world. A lot of retailers do incredibly well out of stores from both a physical and an omni-channel perspective. So we always try and look at it on the 2 basis. How well is the store doing from people going through the doors and spending at the tills, and how well does that store do in terms of contributing to the overall performance? And those 2 bases can sometimes be quite different. So you can have a store that performs moderately to good, and you can have a store that in an omni-channel world performs fantastically. So as a collective, it's got a much higher value. So for us, it's not about imposing set percentages or preconceived ideas about what a scheme should look like. It's about listening, understanding, and then trying to implement. But this is why a day like today is so good, because obviously you have a cross-section of landlords, retailers, agents, and you swap opinions, and you don't always agree, and sometimes you do disagree. But I think collecting those opinions and then forming your strategy is really important. And also just the final bit really is keeping it fresh and relevant, and not always looking at the past as a guide to the future. And
the rule book's kind of been ripped up, hasn't it, post-COVID? Yeah. And I think that's quite refreshing in a way. It's challenging, obviously, but for the consumer, potentially quite refreshing.
I think it has and it hasn't. It has in terms of keeping fresh and relevant, and the consumer has different needs and different expectations. I think it hasn't in the out-of-town market, to the sense that the fundamentals worked pre-COVID. They were just really highlighted more during COVID. So we believe that format works really, really well. But to your point, Lisa, you're absolutely right. You do have to keep adapting it but I think the fundamentals are incredibly strong.
Paul, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, sort of for me, the pick of the tenant mix is often, it's a demand thing, isn't it? If you've got demand and you've got choice, then that's a great place to be. And often, I guess, many landlords probably haven't got that choice in many cases. So I think the thing for me is around, I suppose you create that demand by having a nice broad marketing campaign for any vacant space you've got, and that can be quite difficult to make sure you're tapping into that very local market and those sort of niche operators that perhaps really can transform a location. So it's down to the retained agents, isn't it, and making sure they're doing the job as best they possibly can, and make sure we're getting out to the right occupiers. But there are plenty out there. You know, the idea that retail is struggling. There's a huge amount of very well-funded businesses out there buying a lot of stock, and so it's actually quite exciting in the marketplace. I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. What trends do you anticipate will shape the out-of-town retail market, and how is Quadrant Estates positioning itself to leverage these changes, James?
Very good question. We touched on it briefly earlier, but I think the ESG considerations are only going to get stronger and stronger. I think the market has dabbled in that with EV charging. There's been some bits of PV to create a renewable energy sort of infrastructure on site, if you like, but typically with individual stores and individual retailers. So I think more landlord-led, scalable PV and the use of renewable energy on site will be a trend. I think we've seen a lot of sort of brown to green or potential for stranded assets in the world of offices. Clearly yet we haven't seen a lot of environmental considerations to that scale in retail, but I believe that is certainly going to be a future trend. So Quadrant are very much alongside what we call the day job, trying to position ourselves to advise investors not just on the EV charging. What I think there's obviously a lot of EV charging companies here today. That part of the market is very, very well established.
Yes.
But I think on the PV and renewable energy and also the social side, you know, the S in that part of the equation as well, are all trends that I think are not embryonic, but not as advanced in retail as they are in other subsectors.
And I was going to add to that. We did a roundtable recently with on industrial market, and actually when you sort of ask that same question to the likes of Pro Lodges, you know, they are very much, we have to build BREEAM, EPC rated A buildings, and it's BREEAM outstanding and this sort of stuff, because you know the lettings they're doing is DHL and people like that, and that ESG agenda is so hot in that marketplace. And I think sort of in the retail space, the occupiers aren't quite so big, but they're still big, and that kind of ESG agenda is very much going to start biting further down, I think. So it's very obvious in the super shed market of kind of just how much that trend has hit, and that clearly is coming to retail, absolutely.
So definitely something to watch out for and retail going forward. Guys, final question. How will out-of-town locations be impacted by the focus on net zero and greater emphasis on the use of public transport?
Yeah, sort of following on from the previous question, I suppose, I think that one of the benefits has always been that you have free parking for out-of-town retail, and obviously the convenience with people being able to use their car. And most leases on a retail park will reflect that the landlord isn't to charge for the car park unless designated by statute. Now, if there was government legislative changes to that degree, predicting that's very, very hard, because we clearly don't know how deep that might go. But I believe that actually a lot of out of town is quite sustainable, because people are able to do a number of linked trips all in one shop. Obviously with the rise in EV cars, that's another tick in the sustainability box as well, particularly if it can be charged on site. So I suppose what we're really saying is retail parks can create their own ecosystem that is sustainable. Obviously there is pressure on that car market, but we feel that we can work with that, with the likes of the EV changes, rather than fight against it.
It's all about evolving, as we were saying earlier, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Paul, would you like to add anything to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar sort of thing, isn't it, really? It's kind of the ESG agenda, but equally, one of the questions we've got at the moment is kind of what is the impact of the EV on that net zero kind of position. If you draw the red line around the plan and you put the supermarket in it, you've then got all the out of town retail location, and then you've got this charging going on. And again, thinking about super sheds again, sort of part of what they're doing there is to make sure they've got control of the EPC. Is that then there's also perhaps an offering of doing some of the fit out at the same time, so that you can, in their case, they can build a big super shed EPC rated A, Tenant can go and fit out and put a load of tungsten lighting, and then suddenly you end up with a C, and that kind of then affects their own ESG agenda. So actually, I think part of that it's going to be a very big impact. I think so. Whether you see, sort of part of that fit out being kind of governed very carefully, so that we are kind of hitting as landlords kind of our own ESG agendas. But I think it's very much coming through from the retailer's point of view. I think that's sort of coming very soon. I think so. The impact on fit out and the sort of the ways in which we're fitting these buildings out, and whether the occupiers are fitting it out, impact of EVs and this sort of stuff. It's all very much here coming now. It's either coming now or it's here already. So.
Certainly interesting times ahead for the out-of-town market. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been really interesting to talk to you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.